And we're back in the car on a Saturday like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Saturday late afternoon here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, today marks 34 years since the release of a not very good action wannabe pseudo blockbuster, but a film that is notable because it continued the slow march upward of its star, a real character, somebody who I, to some extent, idolized, not because he was a particularly good actor or made particularly good movies, but because he had a good physique, and he had better than a good physique. He had a fantastic physique, but he had a fantastic physique in what appeared to be normal human parameters. And this is where you get into kind of action hero legends of the 80s and into the 90s, where you have different tiers of, well, what do these people look like? Because there were action heroes who looked more or less like normal people, such as Chuck Norris, for example, and Bruce Willis. They made different kinds of action movies, though, generally speaking. Although, Bruce could have starred in Code of Silence if it had been a couple of years later. But you also had Arnold Schwarzenegger at the kind of top tier, just absolutely jacked years after he retired from bodybuilding in films like Commando and Predator, The Running Man, Twins, Total Recall, Terminator 2, and even Last Action Hero and True Lies, where Arnold is still huge. That's what she said. But Arnold is still a very large human. He does not have a believable physique in any way, shape, or form. And then you had Sylvester Stallone, who is not nearly the size of Arnold. Again, that's what she said. But Sly's look in movies like Rambo still doesn't and didn't appear to me to be achievable by a normal person. In Rocky IV, that's not a normal person human look. That looks very enhanced. And hey, there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't look like a real person body to me, and it didn't when I was a kid. But released 34 years ago today, on August 9, 1991, moviegoers far and wide, all across the US of A and around the world, felt the Dammage with the release of the aforementioned, not very good movie, Double Impact. And Jean-Claude Van Damme is the kind of action star who, he was an international star for sure, but he was somebody who had a really good physique, but it appeared that it didn't seem as if he was, let's just say, chemically enhanced. Now, I don't know why 15 or 16-year-old me even gave a shit about any of that. I was just a kid who was not in good shape, who really, I'm almost being too kind to myself. I was a kid who was a mess in every sense, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and physically. I looked terrible. I felt terrible. I wanted to look better, thinking that looking better would make me feel less terrible. That really wasn't the case. I can vouch for that. But I was trying to move in the direction, at least, of maybe being a little bit healthier. And I saw Van Damme as somebody who, he wasn't Arnold, he wasn't Stallone, but he was more impressive than Bruce Willis and Chuck Norris, put it that way. Yeah, kind of on the order of a slightly bigger Mel Gibson, let's say it like that. But Van Damme had some kind of a quality, and he wasn't afraid to poke fun at himself. And there is something to be said, and this is one reason why I always believed that Arnold was able to surmount the fact of the heavy accent and people making fun of him. They were making fun of him going back to the 70s for the accent, but he was always poking fun at himself. He was self-deprecating in a way that, the Chuck Norris of that era, Stallone, really didn't get into that. And it was an endearing quality. And Jean-Claude Van Damme, in movies such as Kickboxer, not so much his first big movie, which was the one where he played Frank Dux. It's funny that I can't remember. Bloodsport. I almost blanked out on that. But in movies like Kickboxer and like Lionheart, and to some extent Death Warrant, which were the big movies released in this country before Double Impact, Van Damme showed that he had a sense of humor about himself. Steven Seagal, another action star in the era, who didn't really necessarily have much of a physique, but he was the practitioner of the very particular kind of martial arts which when he was at his best, it translated well on screen. But Van Damme had that self-deprecating quality. He was willing to make fun of his accent in the way of Arnold. He was willing to make fun of how ridiculous he sounded in so many different movies and how stupid he looked. He wasn't taking himself too seriously. And Kickboxer is one of the best examples of that, because that's a pretty tragic story. A real-life fighter, Dennis Alexio, plays his brother in that film, and he is criticized. He is crippled in the ring fighting this horrendous, awful, dastardly villain named Tong Po. And Tong Po is... The world of the movie Kickboxer, it's almost a heightened reality. Like this wouldn't happen, but it's not quite the heightened reality of the first Mortal Kombat movie in the mid-90s, where now we're into magical realism. Now we're into sword and sandal sorcery bullshit. Like this can't be real. But Kickboxer showed Van Damme had a sense of humor about himself in that famous sequence, which he later, decades later recreated on, I don't know if it was Leno or Jimmy Kimmel, but it's where his character is completely bombed out of his mind, drunk as a skunk, and he's dancing in a bar, and he's beset upon by about 8 people trying to beat the shit out of him, and he fucking crushes them all. That's the kind of scene that no other action star of that era, they wouldn't have it. And it was the fact that Van Damme not only did it, but he pulled it off with such style and such panache, or panache if you prefer. It just showed that he was a little bit different. And Double Impact is a movie where they don't take enough advantage of the story. In other words, of the concept. And I remember summer of '91 was a really good movie summer. You had Naked Gun 2.5, which was a big hit. You had Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which it was a huge hit, but it's not that good. Spoiler alert, Robin Hood 1991 with Kevin Costner, it's a movie that is not, in my opinion, as good as its reputation. Despite Costner, giving his best, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, terrific. There's nothing wrong with her performance. Sean Connery in a tiny role as King Arthur, I guess years before he played King Arthur, I think, or maybe I have that wrong. I know that Connery has a cameo in that film. Terminator 2 was the home run of that summer. But Double Impact, the concept of these sort of two brothers who are not, I don't remember, are they long lost brothers and they only find out they're brothers, or maybe they were, I think it was that they were separated at birth, but it was some kind of an angle like that. But that's not how the movie was promoted. The film was promoted in a very specific fashion, and this is the sort of film where Roger Ebert, my favorite film critic, I always talk about him because he had so many salient points that he made about films in these eras of 70s, 80s, and 90s, because he saw all of the big movies and often talked about them either just on the TV show he had with Gene Siskel, and then later other film critics such as Richard Roeper, but in interviews, in critical essays that he would sometimes write. But Roger Ebert had a thing where he would talk about that sometimes studios, when they got to marketing a movie, they marketed it as if it's the film they wanted to make, or that they think they should have made, rather than the movie they actually did make. And Double Impact is a perfect example of this. And we see this. This isn't the only time that this happened. So where I was going with, I remember seeing the posters. The posters for the film advertised, yes, Van Damme is playing the role of twin brothers. And a number of years later, I don't remember the name of the movie, but Antonio Banderas and his bride, Melanie Griffith, he played this movie. It was called Too Much. Just a terrible, terrible movie. A lot worse of a movie than Double Impact. But in that film, Antonio Banderas plays twin brothers. And they have to go back and forth pretending, each one pretends to be the other. And one of the brothers is with Daryl Hannah, and the other brother is with Melanie Griffith. It gets very confusing, and the movie is just not good. But this film was promoted in a way that indicated that the twin brothers had clearly distinguished personalities, characteristics, and clearly delineated skill sets, things that they were good at versus maybe they're not so good at. And the way it was promoted, in one half of the poster, you had Jean-Claude Van Damme, very well dressed, holding a gun. And then you also had Jean-Claude Van Damme not that well dressed, dressed as if he's going to take part in the Kumite in Bloodsport, and the film was promoted as one packs a punch, one packs a piece, implying that we're going to get a movie where one brother is really handy with a gun, and that's pretty much what he's going to do, and the other brother is Kumite level, kickboxer level, and away we go. Let's just make a movie. Well, when you actually watch the movie, that's about 2 minutes. And in the rest of the film, the brothers have seemingly interchangeable skills. Both are good with weapons, and both will beat the shit out of the next 100,000 guys in their path. So this was what Roger Ebert was talking about, where the studio wished that they had made the movie where you could actually tell the brothers apart by what they're good at versus what they don't have any clue as to what they're doing. And this is not that movie. So Double Impact, I did not see in theaters. Jean-Claude Van Damme movies in my life that I saw in theaters. Oddly enough, 3 films of Van Damme's I saw in theaters. I saw Sudden Death on its opening weekend in 1995, and that was unfortunately a turning point for JCVD because he seemed to be about to reach the top tier of, kind of action heroes. And Sudden Death, which is, I talked about it in the Guilty Pleasures, for the Guilty Pleasure series, it is a really good example of the Die Hard on a Die Hard in a Die Hard with a subgenre of movies that cropped up, starting with the original Die Hard, Sudden Death, Die Hard in a sports arena. But that particular film saw on its opening weekend, and it was a packed crowd at the then still very new Broadway Mall, and all indications were, because both Siskel and Ebert, 2 thumbs up, and even Jeffrey Lyons and Michael Medved, who were kind of, well, more so Medved, was a real crank of a critic, I thought. He was always being very snarky and sarcastic, more so even than Ebert. Well, Ebert was sarcastic, but not in the same way. But they both liked it. The general critical consensus was that this film is a lot of fun and go see it. I thought Sudden Death was going to be the biggest hit of Van Damme's career, and it did just okay. And the momentum that he had, looking like he was going to continue to ascend, it was kind of cut off at the pass. So Sudden Death is a film that I love, and if I'm asked what's the best movie that Van Damme ever made as star, that's what I'm going to say. Because Sudden Death, of the kind of Die Hard clones, it's in the upper echelon of Die Hard clones. It's not as good as The Negotiator, but it's certainly better than Snake Eyes, and it's comparable with Toy Soldiers. I think I might actually prefer Toy Soldiers slightly, but it's a really good movie, and that is another example of a film where Van Damme's character does not take himself too seriously, and he's playing to the audience in that film in a very endearing way that a lot of the other stars of the era, they didn't do it the way JCVD did it. So saw Sudden Death in theaters, and then I actually saw 2 films from '96 in theaters. I saw The Quest, which somebody, a fellow film student at New York University, saw in theaters. He said the movie was hilarious. Now, it was not promoted as a comedy. It was not a comedy, but he kept saying, it's one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. You've got to see it. And you know what? The movie was pretty funny. It was funny in an unintentional way. Van Damme's character is absurd. The stunt casting of Roger Moore is where you get most of the laughs, because, the former James Bond, a decade earlier, was his last time in the tux and drinking the dry martinis, shaken, not stirred. That movie is not good, but yes, it has a lot of big laughs, many of which are unintentional. But then, the last Jean-Claude Van Damme film I saw in theaters, in 1996, towards the end of the year, I saw Maximum Risk with a fashion model who became a pretty big star in her own right, thanks to the success of another movie from '95, Species, Natasha Henstridge. Now, Maximum Risk is not a good movie, but I saw it at the Movies at Sunrise Mall in Massapequa Theater, which has been gone since 1998. The last film I saw there was Dark City. Highly recommended. A fantastic science fiction film. Alex Proyas. The year before The Matrix. It has Matrix-y vibes. But Maximum Risk, something happened when I went to see that movie at the Sunrise Mall. It was a late afternoon screening, and it was not that many people in the theater. The film was bombing. This was opening weekend, and there were maybe 15 people in the theater. That ain't a good sign for the opening day. So watching the movie, and it's about a half hour in, and I'm like, man, this is a real snooze fest. This film sucks. And just as I was thinking that, the print burned. Now, this is something that happened at NYU a couple of times where there were old prints, and I've always felt the projector that they would use at the Tisch School of the Arts on the 7th floor, I felt there was an issue with the projector. And every once in a while, you would have a print that wasn't playing properly, and it would look like the film itself was burning. Well, here we were watching Maximum Risk, and a movie, as I say, I was not really enjoying it at all, and all of a sudden, it looked like the print caught fire. It looked like it caught fire, and not because Natasha is so hot. It started to burn, and it made this really terrible noise, and then all of a sudden, the thing cut off, and all we saw was like a staticky image, and then nothing for like 30 seconds. So the few people in the theater were all looking around at each other. The lights came on. Nobody said anything. And somebody's like, I guess we're supposed to go to the front. Maybe we get our money back. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, we did see a half hour of this trash. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. So as it turned out, we did get our money back. Just sort of walked over we walked back to the register, and they were very, very gracious. They didn't say anything like, well, you saw a half hour, we'll give you a pro rata. Everybody who was in the theater, they not only gave us a refund, they gave us back the $5 or whatever it was, because it was a matinee. They gave us a complimentary ticket. They said, this really shouldn't have happened. We're very sorry. We don't remember the last time this happened. Yeah, I remember the last time this happened when I was sitting in a classroom. But yeah, then when I ended up watching that movie, I rented it. It didn't get any better. The old saying, if nothing happens by the end of the first reel, nothing's going to happen. The movie was very much of a thumbs down. But Double Impact is a film that I kind of wish I saw in theaters, because it's certainly a better movie than both Maximum Risk and Double Impact. And I guess in the Van Damme of his prime era, his kind of salad days, I think the one he did with Dennis Rodman in the 90s, not good. I mean, it's okay. Double Team, There was too much in the way of basketball jokes because of Rodman getting into it. He did a movie with Rob Schneider. That wasn't good. He just did a lot of bad films. But in his kind of run-up to where it looked like he was going to go to kind of superstar, megastar status, I think Kickboxer's okay. Bloodsport, I think, is actually really good. Even with the weirdness of, is there something otherworldly going on here, as there seems to be at certain points in Kickboxer. Lionheart is very funny, but Lionheart is intentionally funny. Van Damme is getting laughs because his character is absurd, and he's playing into the ridiculousness, and it makes the movie, to me, more entertaining. And I do wish that, Seagal of that era was more willing to be self-deprecating. He really didn't get into that. And, those guys, they had a one-way feud. It was Seagal who had a problem with Van Damme, not the other way around. And, there was supposedly that time that they were at Stallone's place in Miami in the 90s, and they were going to have a fight. And the way Van Damme tells the story, he was into it, but Seagal thought it was stupid, and he didn't want to do it. But a more recent vintage, the two guys had become friends, and Van Damme on his social media basically said, Steven and his wife, they had me over, and what a great time we had, and what a wonderful guy. It was great to finally actually have some conversation with this guy. We were supposed to be enemies for decades, and there wasn't really any beef between us. It was just, and he made it seem as if it was all nonsense. Yeah, it was the fact that Seagal trashed him on a talk show in like the late 80s. There wasn't any reason for it. It's not like anybody was saying, do you have a problem with this guy? Well, what are you going to do? So the actual experience of seeing Double Impact, I rented it. Yeah, I mean, it's just okay. It's on par with Van Damme's Death Warrant. That's another movie where conceptually it should be a better film than it is, where, he's kind of goes behind bars and he's trying to solve a crime, and it should be better. Again, they didn't take enough advantage of the concept. And this happens with some of these action movies when, even back then, they're selling it to an international audience, and they're not interested in having a plot that has from point A to point B to point C. They just want to have big splashy action sequences that they can put together for a trailer, and they can sell the movie like that, and we're going to make money because this doesn't really have much of a budget. And that's what the story was with Double Impact. American audiences wanted more than what the film gave. because the concept was there to do something more interesting than what we ended up seeing. For example, in Van Damme's Universal Soldier, a film, you know what, I forgot I did see that in theaters. That film also has a sense of humor. Both Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren, it's like they're in on the joke. They're in on the joke, and the audience is in on the joke, and it works. But in films like Nowhere to Run, you can see Van Damme trying to go in different directions, and then Time Cop, which is, I think, a really good movie. I think that's undersold how good it is. The science fiction concept is really interesting, and the special effects work is good. Van Damme playing the same character over different time periods. You get to make fun of his accent a little bit. And also Hard Target from '93, the same year as Nowhere to Run, which was John Woo's, the kind of introduction of the terrific John Woo, who later did Broken Arrow and one of the best action films ever made, Face Off. Man, John Woo, what an awesome filmmaker. Wind Talkers was okay with Nicolas Cage. But Van Damme got to work with a lot of the big names, really talented filmmakers such as John Woo and, Peter Hyams, who did Sudden Death. And you look at Stallone's career in his kind of salad days of making action movies, he didn't work with honestly directors as good as John Woo and Peter Hyams, arguably, in that era of his big action movies, from not so much Assassins, but when you talk about like Judge Dredd, not that great as far as action movies, and even Tango and Cash, Demolition Man, I don't know. Well, Cliffhanger, Rennie Harlin, but you could argue, is Rennie Harlin is he as good a filmmaker as Peter Hyams or John Woo? I don't know. I mean, I think they're certainly comparable, but the overall premise is that Double Impact, while not altogether successful, continued JCVD's upward trajectory, which would continue going up until the only limited success of Sudden Death, which was certainly the biggest budget movie that he was ever in. And the fact that it just didn't land, it didn't stick the landing with audiences, and that was pretty much it as far as putting him, in big budget American films where they're not necessarily selling it to the international audience, they're selling it to American audiences. Sudden Death ended up doing quite well overseas, and the overall tally looks good, but it just didn't hit in America. And that's the way it goes. You have people who are groomed and primed for superstardom, and it doesn't hit the way that we expect. And you just have to settle for being a second tier and not on the exalted top tier, which really we're only two guys if we're being honest. Well, three if you count Bruce, but Bruce did a lot of other stuff. But Stallone and Arnold and Bruce, because the other guys like Mel Gibson and Kurt Russell, they did all kinds of different movies, as I've talked about. But Double Impact, one packs a punch, one packs a piece, 2 times the Van Dammage, released on this day, 1991. A guilty pleasure movie for sure, but a film that doesn't take enough advantage of its intriguing concept, but it allows Van Damme to perpetrate all manner of mayhem and Van Dammage upon the bad guys. This has been episode 590 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Saturday afternoon into early evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.